They looked like the perfect family. On screen, the Duggars were a portrait of Christian wholesomeness. 19 children, that's right, 19, two smiling parents, a home built on order, obedience, and unwavering faith. They prayed together, they courted instead of dated, and they wore modest clothes and spoke in very soft voices. While most reality shows thrived on dysfunction, 19 Kids and Counting promised something different, a godly family untouched by modern chaos. But it was a lie. Behind the scenes was a world shaped by authoritarian theology, silence, and control. The family's strict rules weren't quirky, they were the product of a fundamentalist ideology called the Institute in Basic Life Principles. And when the truth came out that the eldest son, Josh, had done some very inappropriate things to multiple girls, including his sisters, well, the illusion began to collapse. So we are going to jump into the Duggar scandal. Everything leading up to it, during it, in between, and after. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you are new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. Right now, I'm posting one video a week. I kind of changed my upload schedule. I'm trying to do more quality over quantity right now. So let me know if you like these longer, a little more edited videos, or if you just want me to go back to being snarky off the cuff and doing reactions. I just want to I'm a people pleaser, obviously, so I want to make y'all happy. Also, quick disclaimer, it is like storming every single day where I live, and it's humid and it's hot. It's a weird combination. So I might get sweaty, my hair might get frizzy, the lights might shut off at weird times, you might hear thunder. Who knows? The world is in utter turmoil. So please just stick with me. But I am just really, really glad you guys are here. And a lot of you wanted to get a deep dive into the Duggars. So here it is. Now, I know that you wanted this because I asked if y'all would in my IBLP video, which I will link right here and in the description down below. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, or if you want just a deeper look into this religion/cult that the Duggars were so heavily involved in. So definitely watch it. It's not really a precursor. You can watch this and then go click on that video, or watch that and come back to this one. Totally up to you. In any case, I'm glad y'all are here, and I know this is a long intro, but I also want to mention that I am sponsoring a teacher every single week next month on my channel. So if you are a teacher who is in need of some classroom supplies, please create an Amazon wish list and email it to me along with a little bit about yourself. My email is letfresherin@gmail.com. So with all of that being said, finally, let's get into the video. It all started innocently enough. In the early 2000s, Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar were an Arkansas couple with an ever-expanding brood of well-behaved children and an uncanny knack for attracting television cameras. And I'm child-free by choice. I can't imagine having one, let alone 19. No, thank you. No, thank you. But some religions believe that the more children you have, the better place you will have in heaven. But anyways, this family with its biblical values and matching outfits and eerily obedient children made for absolutely irresistible television. Their first appearance came in 2004 on a TLC special called 14 Children and Pregnant Again. And that special was a hit. So TLC followed it up with several more. By 2008, the Duggars had landed a full-fledged reality show. 17 kids and counting. The number in the title changed with each new baby, and eventually they settled at 19 kids and counting by the time this family was done, counting. The show was a soft focus portrait of Christian family life on steroids. There were chore charts, home births, and courtships with chaperones. The older kids raised the younger ones, and everyone's names started with the letter J. Jim Bob and Michelle ruled the household like benevolent monarchs of this pint sized little kingdom. It was domestic discipline with a smile, and audiences, they were fascinated. The show stood out in the chaos of reality TV for its wholesomeness. There were no drunken screaming matches, no sex scandals, just a family that prayed together, homeschooled together, and birthed babies like it was a competitive sport. But there was always something that was just a little off. The girls, they never wore pants. The kids, they didn't even watch TV, even though they were on it. And the family talked about purity a lot. The dates were chaperoned, engagements were handshakes until they got the ring. The phrase defrauding got tossed around like it was part of everyday English, and yet the show never explained why. TLC left it all implied. The Duggars were simply Christian. But in reality, they were practicing a very specific brand of fundamentalist Christianity, one rooted in the teachings of none other than Bill Gothard and the Institute in Basic Life Principles. And IBLP wasn't just an influence. It was the blueprint. Now, to understand the Duggars, you have to understand IBLP because their entire way of life was built from that very playbook. And since I've already done a deep dive, I'm not going to go too much into the specifics, but we'll give you a brief little overview. So, Jim Bob and Michelle discovered Bill Gothard's teachings in the late 1980s, shortly after the birth of their second child. Overwhelmed and searching for some parenting guidance, they attended Gothard's Basic Seminar, a week-long crash course in biblical principles for family success. And they emerged from that seminar converted, not just spiritually, but culturally. They then signed up for Gothard's Advanced Training Institute, ATI, a homeschooling program that would shape every aspect of their children's lives. There were no textbooks. There was no standardized testing. No, instead, the Duggar children learned math, science, history, and even medical advice through wisdom booklets, all built around cherry-picked Bible verses and moral anecdotes. Biology lessons were rooted in scripture about cleanliness, and literature was replaced by character studies. Now, critical thinking? No. It was not encouraged because obedience was. Gothard's goal wasn't to produce these scholars, it was to produce believers, loyal, easily controllable ones. And Jim Bob and Michelle were model students. What emerged inside the Duggar home wasn't just a large family with tidy routines. It was an engineered environment of total control. Every inch of daily life was micromanaged, not by whim or by preference, but by the theological scaffolding of Bill Gothard's ideology. It was order, marketed as love, obedience, rebranded as joy. Now, at first glance, the Duggars' lifestyle looked like a wholesome discipline. But dig even slightly beneath the surface, and it becomes clear that this was not traditional parenting. It was a fully formed, doctrine-based framework dictated by IBLP's interpretation of scripture and maintained through constant vigilance. Dating? Forbidden. Now, in the Duggar world, romantic relationships followed the rules of courtship, a concept that sounds quaint until you understand its implications. Now, courtship within the IBLP religion and the Duggar household was not simply dating with boundaries, it was dating under surveillance. Every single interaction was overseen by parents. Every text message went through Jim Bob or Michelle. The couple was never alone. They didn't hold hands, they didn't kiss, and side hugs were the most contact permitted, and only after becoming official. Courtships had to be approved, initiated, and guided by the father, who held full veto power. The underlying belief was that the daughters, in particular, belonged to their fathers until transferred via marriage to a new male authority. Awesome. This is exactly why I walked myself down the aisle. Now, modesty wasn't just a suggestion here, it was policy. Girls and women in the Duggar household wore only long skirts or dresses, often with leggings or thick tights underneath, no matter the weather. Pants were explicitly forbidden as they were considered masculine. The body had to be hidden, not because of dignity, but because it might defraud a man. Defrauding was the IBLP catch all term for stirring up impure thoughts in others, and the responsibility for preventing male lust fell entirely on the women. Shoulders, knees, collarbones, they were all potential stumbling blocks for male eyes. Oh no, heaven forbid a man see a collarbone and might get an erection, right? Now, Michelle once said they avoided clothing that drew attention to the body shape, and the daughters wore layered tops even when swimming or playing sports. In their world, modesty wasn't at all about self-respect. It was completely about male control. And secular culture shunned entirely. Now, you're all smart, so I am sure that you recognize the irony of the Duggars making their income from a mainstream television show while basically banning all forms of mainstream entertainment, including music, television, or even engage in any kind of pop culture. Their children were not allowed to access the internet without filters and supervision because Gothard taught that media introduced rebellion, temptation, and demonic influence into the home. In his seminars, he warned that rock music, including even Christian rock, could summon evil spirits. The Duggars used music from IBLP's approved library, or they composed their own songs, often centered on Bible verses or obedience-themed lyrics. Movies, if permitted, were vetted Christian productions with explicit moral lessons. But even then, viewing was communal and never individual. The goal wasn't education or entertainment, it was indoctrination through repetition and controlling the narrative. This is the classic eye in the bite model. Information control. They don't want you to have any access to any other point of view because, oh no, you might start, thinking critically and decide this lifestyle wasn't for you. But how about family planning? Well, with a TV show called 19 Kids and Counting, I'm sure you could guess it was not permitted. Jim, Bob, and Michelle were very vocal about their decision to eschew all forms of birth control, including natural family planning. They publicly linked the early use of birth control pills to miscarriage, which they interpreted as divine punishment. And I hope that none of you hear that and internalize it if you have had a miscarriage, because that is a horrific thing to experience and go through. And I just, how abhorrent of someone to blame it on you, you know? So from then on, they viewed every pregnancy as a gift and every effort to prevent one as rebellion against God. Gothard taught that children are a blessing, and to reject a blessing was to reject the blesser. The underlying implication: a woman's godliness was measured in part by her fertility. And Michelle even described herself as a baby machine with apparent pride. Her children were her ministry, her identity. And now, as for the hierarchy within the family and within the church, because it wasn't just encouraged, it was sacred. According to Gothard, the family structure was divinely ordered. At the top stood the father, God's representative, and then the mother, who submitted joyfully. And then all the children whose role was total obedience. The family existed under this metaphorical umbrella of protection, a concept that is drilled into IBLP students. If a child, especially a daughter, stepped outside the authority of her father, that umbrella was removed. You can stand under my umbrella. Yeah, you're losing your umbrella, girl. It's raining outside. You can stand under my umbrella. You don't got an umbrella. She would be exposed to spiritual attacks. And to Gothard, this wasn't just metaphorical danger, it was literal. Demonic oppression, calamity, and suffering, all that safety was conditional, and submission was the price. Great. And Michelle modeled this dynamic with a saccharine smile. She referred to Jim Bob as the spiritual leader and often said that her job was to support him and obey him and keep a cheerful heart. Joyful submission was a constant theme in her public appearances. If she felt upset or disagreed with him, she said she would pray silently rather than challenge his decision. This was not mutual respect. It was deference presented as devotion. And even the children were divided into roles. Now, you're probably wondering, how do two parents effectively parent 19 children? Well, they don't, or they don't very effectively. What they do is force their older children to grow up too fast and, in turn, parent their siblings. Because the older girls in the group were unofficial second mothers, assigned buddy teams of younger siblings to raise, dress, feed, bathe, and even homeschool. Jana Duggar, the eldest daughter, spent her young adult years raising her siblings instead of pursuing a career, college, or her own family. But what about the boys, you're probably wondering? Well, they were encouraged to lead, to preach, to teach, to protect. While they too had worked and had chores, the emotional labor of the home and the diapers, the meals, the nursing, the discipline, that all fell squarely on the girls. Gender roles weren't just enforced, they were literally spiritualized and expected. Every single decision in the home, from what music they could play to who a kid could marry, had a theological justification behind it. But the average viewer tuning in to 19 Kids and Counting didn't see the doctrine. They saw novelty. They saw home haircuts performed on a kitchen stool with a cheerful audience of siblings. They saw children with name tags, buddy systems, and endless smiles. They saw chore charts and scripture memorization challenges and homespun crafts. They saw large-scale parenting as an organizational miracle, not a rigid control structure with high-stakes consequences. And what they also didn't see was the coercion, the fear, the erasure of personal identity in favor of family order. They didn't see the punishment for emotional expression. They didn't hear the lectures on obedience tied to demonic oppression. They didn't see the spiritual blackmail, obey your father or risk eternal consequences. And critically, they didn't hear the words IBLP, ATI, or even Bill Gothard. TLC scrubbed those names from the narrative. Instead, the Duggars were just Christian. Yeah, sure, they were quirky, but they were safe, familiar, lovable. And that was the genius and the danger of the Duggars' fame. They didn't just live IBLP, they made it look normal. By 2015, the Duggars weren't just reality TV stars, they were a cultural institution. 19 Kids and Counting had been airing on TLC for 7 years, drawing millions of viewers per episode. The Duggars were staples of morning talk shows, homeschool conferences, and right-wing political campaigns. Jim Bob and Michelle had authored multiple best-selling books on parenting and faith, and their children, especially the older daughters, had become household names among evangelical audiences. The Duggar brand wasn't just big, it was bulletproof. They represented a kind of idealized domestic vision for conservative America. An endlessly multiplying family bound by faith, tradition, and cheerful obedience. They were the embodiment of family values, sold to the masses with warm smiles and a matching wardrobe. But that illusion would come crashing down in May 2015. and with it, the cracks in the facade that had been there all along. The scandal that would implode the Duggar empire was not new, and it wasn't even recent. It had been quietly buried over a decade earlier. On May 21st, 2015, In Touch Weekly published a bombshell report based on a 2006 police investigation. The documents revealed that Josh Duggar, the eldest son of Jim, Bob, and Michelle, had essayed at least 5 underage girls, 4 of whom were his sisters, over the course of 2002 and 2003 when he was 14 and 15 years old. The police report laid out a timeline that was disturbing not only for what happened, but for how methodically it had been covered up. In March 2002, Jim Bob Duggar learns from one of his daughters that his son Josh had inappropriately touched her while she slept. This was not a one-time incident. Other siblings would later disclose similar abuses. And rather than alerting law enforcement, Jim Bob confronts Josh himself. Josh apologizes, and the family just moves on. But between 2002 and 2003, despite that confrontation, of course, because this is what happens when people aren't held accountable, Josh just continued to essay his siblings. He touched multiple girls while they were sleeping or in his care. And these incidents happened in bedrooms, common areas, and even during Bible time. Now, in March 2003, after repeated offenses, Jim Bob consults church elders. Still, there was no report to the police. Instead, the Duggars send Josh away to a Christian counseling program run by a family friend affiliated with their religious circle. The program turns out to be manual labor, remodeling houses. Great. So there's no licensed therapist involved. And Josh would only spend about 3 months there doing hard labor. And upon his return, Jim Bob arranges for Josh to speak with a family friend who is a state trooper, Jim Hutchins. Now, Hutchins gave Josh a stern talking to, but again, no report was filed. Now, ironically and horrifically, Hutchins would also later be convicted and sentenced to decades in prison for possessing child essay material. Wow. This community is messed up. Now, in December of 2006, a whistleblower contacts the Oprah Winfrey Show ahead of a planned Duggar appearance, alerting producers to the abuse. Now, Oprah's team forwards the information to Arkansas authorities, and that prompts the official investigation and the filing of the police report. But by then, the statute of limitations had expired and no official charges were filed. And all the while, TLC kept on filming. Because obviously money matters a lot more than, the safety of children and holding people accountable for their actions. Yeah. Now, by 2008, 17 Kids and Counting had launched. Josh Duggar was a mainstay of the show, portrayed as a smiling, wise older brother. He went on mission trips, he led Bible studies, he began courting and later married Anna Keller, another young woman who was raised in the IBLP world. And together, they had children. And Josh, of all people, became a spokesperson for family values, eventually taking a high-profile position as a lobbyist with the Family Research Council, a conservative Christian political organization that campaigned against LGBTQ+ rights, sex education, and the P word. But viewers had no idea the man preaching about morality and purity had a police report documenting his history of child essay. And worse, the parents who had carefully built their brand around protecting their children had done no such thing. It's disgusting. The In Touch report obviously sent shockwaves through American media. And what made the story so powerful wasn't just the abuse that had occurred. It was the staggering hypocrisy. Jim, Bob, and Michelle had built their brand on the premise that their faith protected their children, that courtship rules, modesty, and scripture kept evil at bay. But the real danger had come from within their own family, and when they discovered it, they didn't report it. They protected no one. They instead covered it up. The family had allowed Josh to remain in the home. They had continued filming a reality show that marketed the children as models of morality and discipline. They had held up Josh as a success story, a product of their system, while knowingly hiding the disgusting things he had done. So obviously, the public was furious. Former fans felt misled. Longtime critics felt vindicated. And the Duggar family, once admired for their values, were now seen as enablers, and even worse, as frauds. So for several days, the Duggars, well, they said nothing. But then in early June, Jim, Bob, and Michelle agreed to a sit-down interview with Megyn Kelly on Fox News. It was clearly a strategic move to frame the story on friendly ground and get ahead of the incoming backlash. But that interview only made things worse. Jim Bob described Josh's actions as mistakes and inappropriate touching. He emphasized that the girls were asleep during most of the incidents, which makes it better? What? He also insisted that Josh had turned his life around, and Michelle focused on forgiveness and healing. They described how their daughters had moved on, how counseling had helped, which means that they're counseling with people within their church who are most likely encouraging the women to shut up about it, but that's, I guess, a topic for another video. And they also expressed that God had restored their family. Okay. And nowhere in the interview did they address why they never went to the police, or why Josh had remained in the home, or why they had allowed him to chaperone younger siblings after the abuse. But the most controversial moment came when Jill and Jessa Duggar, two of the victims, appeared on the Kelly file a few days later. In a painfully uncomfortable interview, both women acknowledged that they were among Josh's victims, but they echoed their parents' talking points. They'd forgiven him. They didn't want the media to exploit the story. They felt violated not by their brother, but by the press. It was hard to watch. These are two young women who are clearly under pressure, trying to publicly defend the brother who had abused them and the parents who failed to protect them. And they're probably listening to the parents who are telling them to undermine their own personal autonomy by then blaming the press for exposing this disgusting stuff instead of saying and being honest with what happened to them. But this all obviously kind of backfired because to the public it felt less like healing and more like damage control. The Duggars weren't telling the truth, they were merely protecting their brand. Now, to the average viewer, the Duggars' handling of Josh's abuse was absolutely baffling. Why hadn't they called the police? Why did they allow this predator to stay in their home with 18 other children? Why put him on national television next to his victims? Why downplay the abuse when confronted with it publicly? To outsiders, it seemed incomprehensible. But within the world of the Institute and Basic Life Principles, that fundamentalist ministry that shaped every corner of the Duggar household, it made perfect, terrible sense. Because IBLP didn't just influence the Duggars, it trained them. Now, founded by Bill Gothard in 1961, IBLP wasn't a church, but it did function like one. It was a sprawling network of seminars, homeschool curricula, training centers, and authoritarian theology cloaked in biblical language. Its mission was to restore God's principles to families, churches, and nations. But beneath that mission was a rigid, patriarchal hierarchy designed to keep everyone, especially women and children, under control. And when it came to abuse, the system wasn't just ill-equipped, it was structured to suppress it. Central to IBLP's teachings is the umbrella of authority, which is a visual metaphor used to illustrate how spiritual protection is granted only to those who remain under God's appointed leaders. Like I mentioned before, we have God at the top, then the father, then the mother, and then the children. But according to this model, questioning or disobeying your authority, even in the face of injustice or danger, meant that you would step outside the umbrella. And once outside, Gothard taught, you opened yourself up to Satan's attacks. Spiritual, emotional, and even physical harm could and probably would follow. Because rebellion wasn't just disobedience, it was a sin. So in practical terms, this meant that a child who was abused was still expected to submit to the authority of her father. A wife, even if mistreated, was expected to remain joyful. fathers were the ultimate gatekeepers, both of discipline and of mercy. They were seen as God's representatives of the home. So when Josh Duggar confessed to molesting his sisters, the decision about what came next wasn't viewed through a legal lens. It was filtered through a theological one. Report him to authorities? That would mean stepping outside the chain of command and breaking faith with God's order. So instead, the family managed it internally just as they'd been taught. Because honestly, Bill Gothard, yeah, he did some pretty sketchy things to young women as well. So, yeah, it seems that these cults just create these rules so that they're protected. And then they almost commend the men for doing these terrible things because it's like follower, like leader, I guess. Now, IBLP emphasized instant forgiveness as a spiritual duty, especially for women. It was the idea that harboring resentment, anger, or grief created a root of bitterness that allowed Satan to gain a foothold in your life. Bitterness, not abuse, was the true spiritual danger. Yeah. So, someone hurts you, someone essays you, you are required to give instant forgiveness. Victims were expected to forgive quickly, completely, and without seeking justice. Justice was framed as vengeance. Legal action was discouraged. And if a victim struggled to forgive, the failure was framed as their sin. Now, this theology had obviously devastating effects on young girls like Jill and Jessa Duggar, because after the abuse, their healing wasn't centered around trauma-informed counseling, but around the imperative to forgive and move on. In interviews, they were praised not for surviving, but for extending grace to their brother. And even more disturbingly, Gothard's literature included stories of young girls being counseled after SA and told to examine their own immodesty, proximity, or even emotional openness as potential causes. Victim blaming at its absolute worst. These teachings didn't always directly blame victims, but they deeply influenced how these victims saw themselves. And if someone's feeling shame, they're even more easily controlled. In this worldview, sin was something you could provoke by being the wrong kind of girl. Now, IBLP strongly discouraged involving secular systems, police, courts, therapists in any family or church matter. Problems, no matter how serious, were to be handled through biblical restoration. In practice, that often meant sending a perpetrator or a predator to a mentor, a training center, or a labor program operated by the ministry itself. And that's exactly what happened with Josh. When his parents learned of the abuse, they didn't call the police. They sent him to a counseling program. Awesome. Now, Gothard's teachings also codified rigid gender roles. Men led and women followed. Men made decisions and women supported them. Men protected and women obeyed. Girls were trained from childhood to be keepers at home. They were taught that their primary value was in serving, submitting, and staying sweet-spirited. This created a double standard in how sin, and especially sexual sin, was handled. Boys were disciplined. Girls were shaped. If a boy like Josh transgressed, the emphasis was on correction and restoration. If a girl was harmed, the focus often shifted to preserving her purity narrative, not pursuing justice. If that meant covering up the abuse, rationalizing it, or rushing to forgive, so be it. And because daughters were raised to trust their father implicitly, they often had no concept of bodily autonomy. They were taught that questioning their dad was a spiritual danger. Speaking out was rebellion, and going to police was betrayal. So they stayed quiet. They obeyed. And so the abuse continued, silently, invisibly, under that umbrella. Now, from a legal standpoint, the Duggars' behavior in 2002 through 2006 did look like negligence. But from an IBLP standpoint, it was fidelity. They'd followed the blueprint. They had protected the father's authority, they had punished sin internally, they had emphasized forgiveness, and they had avoided the courts. They'd sheltered their son and trained their daughters to be loyal, silent, and self-blaming. So the tragedy wasn't that the system failed. It was that it worked exactly as it was intended. And for the first time in the wake of the In Touch Weekly report, the public was forced to confront that reality. that the smiling, orderly, God-fearing family on TV had been exporting a playbook that enabled abuse and punished transparency. Even as the scandal surrounding Josh Duggar consumed headlines and shattered the family's public image, TLC was like, it's not so bad, guys. Let's keep on filming. 19 Kids and Counting had been one of the network's highest rated shows. I mean, it was a franchise with years of footage and a massive built in audience. So, literally just 6 months after the cancellation of 19 Kids, TLC quietly returned to the Duggar well. And in December of 2015, they aired a limited docuseries titled Jill and Jessa, Counting On, a spinoff framed as a fresh start, centering on healing, womanhood, and moving forward. Josh was out. The story was no longer about Jim, Bob, and Michelle at the helm of a mega family, but about the adult Duggar daughters navigating faith, marriage, and motherhood in a post-scandal world. It was a rebrand, and for many, it worked. The show would eventually drop Jill and Jessa from the title and become simply Counting On. New courtships, weddings, and babies provided enough narrative fuel to carry the series through 11 seasons. But beneath the surface of the show's polished image, the Duggar daughters, particularly Jill and Ginger, were undergoing a much more profound transformation. Of all the Duggar children, Jill had once appeared to be the most devout. As the second oldest daughter, she was deeply entrenched in the family structure. Viewers watched her court Derek Dillard under strict chaperone conditions, marry as a virgin, and become a mother all within a year. Her role as a faithful Duggar daughter seemed sealed. But off camera, Jill and Derek were starting to question everything. And according to later interviews, Jill and Derek were never paid directly for their appearances on Counting On. Instead, Jim Bob controlled the money, signing contracts with TLC on behalf of the family and redistributing funds as he saw fit. So for years, Jill filmed while pregnant, nursing, or raising small children, but never saw a paycheck. And when Derek began asking about compensation and pushing for autonomy, the relationship with Jim Bob soured. Derek also noticed that the show dictated their lives. TLC controlled their filming schedules, sometimes pressuring them to appear even during deeply personal moments, including funerals and family disputes. When Jill expressed discomfort, she was reminded that participation was expected. This wasn't just a job, it was part of her identity, the family's witness, God's plan. But luckily, eventually, Jill would walk away from the show entirely. The rift became visible in subtle, unmistakable ways. Jill started wearing pants, something she'd been raised to believe was immodest and rebellious. She got a nose ring, began speaking about using birth control, and publicly acknowledged that she and Derek were pursuing therapy. In the world she came from, these weren't just lifestyle choices, they were theological violations. Jill was challenging Gothard's authority structure, questioning her father's headship, and exercising autonomy, all of which were portrayed as spiritual danger during her upbringing. Each decision she made was a quiet act of defiance, but together they all amounted to something far more powerful, a declaration of independence. Now, while Jill was pulling away from the family's TV empire, Jinger Duggar of Wollo was carving her own path, and this time from inside the spotlight. After marrying former professional soccer player and pastor Jeremy Vuolo, Ginger moved to LA, a stark departure from the rural, insular world she'd been raised in. Though still a devout Christian, Jeremy's theology was mainstream, reformed rather than fundamentalist, and far more removed from IBLP teachings. In interviews, Ginger began to open up about the deep psychological weight of her upbringing. But it wasn't until the release of her 2023 book, Becoming Free Indeed, that the full picture emerged. In the book, Ginger described her childhood as being ruled by fear. Fear of God's wrath, fear of punishment, fear that stepping outside the rules would bring spiritual and physical ruin. She recalled crying as a child over the prospect of watching a PG-rated film. She worried obsessively that wearing pants or listening to the wrong kind of music might displease God, not because she was fragile, but because she had been conditioned to believe that even small deviations would open the door to Satan. Now, she never outright condemned her parents, but she explicitly rejected the teachings of Bill Gothard, calling them cult-like and harmful. She dismantled piece by piece the idea that God's love was contingent on rules and described her journey as one of disentangling truth from fear. Ginger's transformation was quieter than Jill's, but no less radical. By choosing to speak publicly about her trauma while maintaining her Christian faith, she reached an entirely different audience, those who still believed in God, but no longer believed in Gothard. Neither Jill nor Ginger walked away from their family entirely, but they did something perhaps even more dangerous in the Duggar world. They questioned the structure. They began to see the IBLP system for what it was, a control mechanism dressed up as righteousness. They spoke about emotional manipulation, spiritual guilt, and the exploitation of their labor and image. They asked questions no one was supposed to ask. Why couldn't they access their earnings? Why did their father speak for them even as adults? Why was obedience more important than healing? The answers, or lack thereof, came at a price. Their relationships with Jim Bob and Michelle became strained, and communication was sporadic. Visits were limited. In interviews, Jill admitted that she had to set boundaries with her parents for her mental health, her marriage, and her children's well-being. Ginger was more diplomatic, but made it clear she would not be raising her daughters the way she had been raised. In a family where unity was considered divine, choosing autonomy was basically an act of war. But it was also the only way to survive. Counting on had become a contradiction in itself. The show still projected a sanitized version of the Duggar family, new babies, Pinterest perfect weddings, family game nights. But behind the scenes, the most courageous stories were happening off camera. Jill and Derek had left. Ginger had distanced herself. And more viewers began to see the show for what it was. Not a glimpse into godly living, but a glossy mask covering deep fractures. Now, in May of 2022, when Josh Duggar was sentenced to over 12 years in federal prison for receiving and possessing child SA material, TLC finally canceled the show for good. Wow. It only took you, what, a decade? I guess it came out in 2015, the news of the scandal, but still, 7 years. Come on. When does integrity matter more than money? Please, can we all start valuing some integrity? Dear God. So just like that, the curtain fell. But Jill and Ginger's stories, raw, honest, and still unfolding, offered something more enduring than a television franchise. They offered a roadmap out of fear-based faith. They showed that survival wasn't just about escaping a house. It was about reclaiming your mind. They weren't just leaving IBLP. They were breaking this generational cycle. One rule, one question, one breath at a time. The damage done by the Duggars' upbringing wasn't just ideological, it was psychological. Now, at first glance, the family's lifestyle might have looked strict or old-fashioned, but behind the matching outfits and the chore charts and the Bible memorization was a psychological system that was rooted in fear, shame, and control. This wasn't just conservative parenting, it was totalistic conditioning, a full-scale shaping of belief, identity, and behavior under constant theological scrutiny. Children raised in high-control religious environments, particularly ones rooted in fundamentalist doctrine like that of IBLP, often suffer from what psychologists now refer to as religious trauma syndrome, or RTS. Though it's not yet formally recognized in diagnostic manuals, RTS is a growing field of study, a constellation of symptoms seen in individuals who were raised in environments where obedience was demanded and questioning was condemned, and even spiritual consequences were eternal. The symptoms mirror those of complex PTSD, and they're not confined to moments of explicit abuse. Instead, they emerge from chronic emotional, cognitive, and spiritual stress. In such environments, the stakes of every choice are astronomically high. You're taught that the wrong outfit, the wrong music, the wrong thought could invite demonic attack. That stepping outside the authority structure, questioning your father, your pastor, your God, it might place you outside that umbrella of protection. You might be vulnerable to Satan, sickness, or even eternal damnation. And the fear isn't just metaphorical, it's deeply and physically felt. Now, Jill Duggar Dillard has spoken openly about the paralyzing confusion she experienced when she first began questioning the beliefs that she'd been raised under. After years of submitting to her father's authority, as commanded by IBLP teachings, even minor decisions filled her with guilt and anxiety. Go to therapy, rebellion. Questioning Jim Bob's control over the family finances, insubordination. Wearing pants, spiritually dangerous. She described feeling as though she were betraying not just her family, but God. The act of choosing for herself wasn't liberating at all. It was terrifying. She'd never been allowed to build her own internal compass. Every decision had been filtered through an external authority. So when that structure crumbled, she was left without a guide. She began therapy. She set boundaries with her parents. She stopped filming. And yet, every act of autonomy required mental rewiring because her original programming had equated independence with sin. I mean, I value my independence so, so much. So I can't even imagine the pain and confusion of wanting to be your own person and make your own decisions, but also feeling so much guilt about it. It's heartbreaking to hear. Ginger Duggar Vuolo's story is similarly laced with fear, not from physical abuse, but from internalized spiritual terror. In her memoir, Ginger describes growing up in a mental state of hypervigilance. She feared the wrath of God constantly, even over benign choices like listening to Christian rock music or wearing a pair of jeans. And when she finally did wear pants, she describes experiencing intense panic. Not because anyone confronted her, but because her brain had been trained to expect judgment. Her mind looped with questions. Was she tempting men? Had she displeased God? Was she risking harm to herself or her family by breaking a protection rule? These weren't simple matters of modesty or personal taste. They were deeply encoded fears that made even minor expressions of autonomy feel like catastrophic rebellion. Ginger had to learn how to think, not just what to think, a skill that she never developed in her childhood education, which emphasized rote memorization of Bible verses and character traits over critical thought or emotional exploration. Jill and Ginger have both been clear. They're still Christians. Their faith didn't vanish, but their fear did. And it took years of emotional labor to untangle one from the other. They are among the lucky ones. Many former IBLP kids report far more intense and enduring trauma, severe anxiety, depression, OCD symptoms, dissociation, and even unaliving. Some experience difficulty trusting others, forming healthy relationships, or even making decisions without experiencing guilt. Others wrestle with sexual dysfunction, having been taught from birth that their bodies were dangerous, sinful, and shameful. And this is especially true for girls and women who were told that their very presence could defraud men, that their virginity defined their worth, and that their highest calling was joyful submission. Imagine growing up believing that your thoughts were dangerous, your desires were sinful, and your questions were rebellion, and that your father spoke for God. And then imagine trying to live a normal adult life, like get a job, raise children, set those boundaries with all that mental framework still just running rampant in the background. It's not just hard, it is literally traumatizing. What happened in the Duggar household was not unique to them. It was systemic, built into the very architecture of IBLP and other high control religious systems. When faith becomes fused with authoritarianism, emotional repression, and gender hierarchy, the result isn't spiritual peace. It's a form of psychological imprisonment. Jill and Ginger's stories are powerful not just because they're rare, but because they're familiar to so many who grew up in similar systems. They show us what religious trauma looks like. It's a child who's afraid to speak their mind. It's a teenager sobbing over a pair of jeans. It's a woman learning in her 30s that saying no is not a sin. And it's a generation of survivors trying to rebuild their lives, not without faith, but without fear. Just when it seemed the Duggar family might slowly fade from view, their influence waning, their show quietly winding down, their name no longer dominating headlines, another bomb dropped. And this time, it was nuclear. On April 29th, 2021, federal agents arrested Josh Duggar in Springdale, Arkansas. He was charged with receiving and possessing child SA material, or CSAM, the legal term for what is more widely known as child. The material, prosecutors later revealed, involved children as young as 18 months old. It makes you, I'm nauseous just saying it. It included video and image files described by Homeland Security agents as among the worst of the worst they'd ever seen. And Josh was no teenager experimenting with internet access. He was a grown man, 33 years old, and a father of 6 at the time. And the evidence against him was not incidental. It was damning, deliberate, and technologically sophisticated. The investigation began when agents with the Little Rock Field Office of Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, tracked illegal file downloads to an IP address registered to Wholesale Motor Cars, a used car dealership in Springdale, Arkansas, where Josh worked. Undercover agents traced the activity to a specific computer on site and launched a formal probe. When they executed a search warrant in November 2019, Josh was present. He admitted to owning the computer in question, a desktop tower, and acknowledged that he used it regularly. But he denied knowing anything about the illegal downloads. Federal forensic teams found that the desktop had been partitioned into 2 operating systems, one visible and one hidden. Josh had installed Linux-based software to bypass accountability programs like Covenant Eyes that monitored his internet activity. The illicit material was downloaded using peer-to-peer torrenting networks and then was hidden and deleted. So, it wasn't a careless mistake, it was calculated. And he knew he was being monitored by his wife, by Christian software filters, by his past, and he took active measures to deceive all of them. He pleaded not guilty, and the case went to trial in November 2021 in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Arkansas. Over the course of the trial, expert witnesses from the Department of Justice and HSI presented detailed technical evidence, metadata logs, screenshots, and file hashes linking Josh directly to the download and possessing dozens of explicit videos and images involving prepubescent children. One file in particular, later referred to as Daisy's Destruction, had a reputation on the dark web for being among the most graphically violent known to investigators. His defense team attempted to shift blame, suggesting that a former employee may have accessed the computer, but the timestamps, file logs, and digital forensics told a different story. Josh had not only accessed the material, but taken steps to hide his tracks, actions consistent with conscious guilt. And the jury deliberated for less than 7 hours. And on December 9th, 2021, Josh Duggar was found guilty on both counts. Josh was sentenced to 151 months in federal prison, just over 12 and a half years. He was also ordered to pay fines and register as an SO upon release. The judge noted that Josh had shown no remorse, and prosecutors emphasized that his actions were not only criminal, but a profound danger to society. He was sent to FCI Seagoville, a medium security federal prison in Texas known for housing SOs. The sentence was longer than many had expected, but for some, myself included, it just is not enough. Josh had escaped consequences for his crimes once before, and now, nearly 2 decades after his first known offenses, justice had luckily finally caught up with him. Now, the reaction from the Duggar family was very telling and fractured. TLC canceled Counting On immediately and permanently. There would be no second rebranding, no spinoff. The Duggar name was now synonymous with criminality and cover-up. Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar released a brief and muted statement saying that they were heartbroken and they were praying for everyone involved. They didn't name the victims and they didn't acknowledge the previous abuse. They also didn't apologize. Anna Duggar, Josh's wife, stood by him, astonishingly. Despite the overwhelming evidence, she maintained his innocence and continued to visit him in prison, They welcomed their seventh child just months before his conviction. Jill Duggar Dillard and Derek Dillard issued a strong public response. They condemned Josh's actions unequivocally and praised the justice system and reiterated that no one is above the law. Jill's words carried weight. She was both a sister and a survivor. Jinger also spoke out and called the conviction a sad and sobering moment, but affirming that justice had been done. Like Jill, she emphasized the importance of accountability. And the rest of the family, including Joy, Jessa, John David, and Jana, remained largely silent or posted vague statements about grace and healing. No one from the family confronted the larger system that had enabled Josh in the first place. For years, the Duggars had been accused of hypocrisy, preaching values they didn't live, projecting a pristine image while hiding their dysfunction. But the Josh Duggar conviction turned that hypocrisy into something far more dangerous. It became clear that the family's silence, secrecy, and allegiance to authority above accountability had directly enabled a predator. The ideological framework they followed, a system that prioritized male power, protected abusers, and silenced victims, had allowed Josh to escalate his behavior unchecked. And the public no longer saw the Duggars as just misguided or overly strict. They saw them as complicit. They'd platformed their son on national television, knowing his history. They'd allowed him to raise his own children under the same roof. They had stood by him again in the face of evidence that he was consuming and concealing the most grotesque forms of child exploitation imaginable. This wasn't just a story of one man's sin. It was a case study in how spiritual authority can be weaponized to shield the powerful, silence the vulnerable, and deny justice until it's too late. Josh Duggar will spend the better part of his 40s behind bars, but the consequences of his actions and the system that nurtured them will echo far beyond his prison sentence. As the Duggar family unraveled publicly, first in the 2015 scandal and then again in 2021, the organization that had shaped their entire worldview, the Institute in Basic Life Principles, was conspicuously silent. There were no press conferences, no apologies, no reforms. Despite the fact that the Duggars had been the organization's most visible, influential followers, a walking advertisement for Gothard's teaching, IBLP chose a strategy of non-engagement. Now, perhaps part of the ministry's silence in 2015 had to do with its own mounting scandal. Because even as the Duggars were imploding in the public eye, Bill Gothard, the founder and face of IBLP, was embroiled in allegations of SA himself. Beginning in 2012, former IBLP students and staffers began coming forward, first anonymously and then publicly, with detailed testimonies of grooming, manipulation, inappropriate touching, and emotional abuse at the hands of Gothard himself. These women, many of them teenagers at the time of their interactions with him, described eerily similar patterns. Gothard would single them out, invite them to his personal residence or office, require one-on-one mentoring sessions, and touch their hair, rub their feet, or comment on their appearance, and violate their personal boundaries under the guise of fatherly affection or spiritual guidance. In 2014, over 30 women came forward through the site Recovering Grace, a platform created by former IBLP members. That same year, the IBLP Board of Directors placed Gothard on administrative leave. By March 2014, he had officially resigned, though he continued to deny any wrongdoing. Following Gothard's resignation, IBLP conducted what they called an internal investigation. In June 2014, the organization released a vague statement admitting that some staff had acted inappropriately and that biblical standards were not always upheld. And of course, they did not name Gothard. They did not acknowledge the abuse allegations in detail, and they did not offer apologies to the women harmed. Instead, they framed the issue as a matter of failing to live up to principles without addressing that those very principles enabled the abuse by discouraging dissent, demanding submission, and shielding leaders from accountability. And to this day, IBLP has never formally apologized to the survivors of Gothard's misconduct or to the broader IBLP community for decades of spiritual manipulation. Yeah, and Gothard's still out there just preaching around. Great. Now, if you haven't seen Amazon's expose, Shiny Happy People, you really, really need to. It is absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend the books too. I also highly recommend you watching all of the interviews with the other family members who started dissenting. I highly recommend you read Ginger's book. And man, it's just so much. It's so scary that there are so many groups like this that harm so many people. And then we have network television deciding, oh, we should just exploit this and exploit more people and expose more people to these terrible teachings. And then we're just all going to not acknowledge when these terrible injustices happen, when these terrible behaviors happen. Like, I just want to reiterate, it is never the victim's fault. You could be walking naked on the street. No one deserves to touch you. No one deserves to stare at you. No one deserves to say anything inappropriate to you. That's them. They need to control themselves. And I'm so sorry if you're someone who's experienced something like this. It's just incredibly abhorrent to allow people to live under this veil of God's protection and then shaming women when bad things happen to them by their own loved ones. It's disgusting. So I'm eager to hear what you guys think about all of this. If you have any more insight or suggestions for the next video, or if you just want to talk more about this down in the comments below. You know me, I love healthy conversations, even debates, but let's just keep it civil and, kind to one another. And I hope you guys are staying safe out there. And man, times are so crazy. So just hold on to your loved ones. Be good to each other. Stay safe out there. Ask questions and always stay skeptical. I'll see you in my next video soon. Thank you all so much for watching. Bye.